Greetings everyone to this week's video lecture for History 3326, Modern African History Online. So, the topic of this week is the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade and really of the three major global slave trades that are operating out of Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries. So, really, abolition is going to happen piecemeal, and with a number of European nations involved, they're all going to be passing their own legislation, enacting their own laws that deal with abolition, both in their home country and in their overseas colonies. And they're also going to start making rules for how people engage in Atlantic trade as well. Really, the Danish are the first European country to outlaw the trade in Atlantic slaves. They say to their citizens, it is no longer legal to start to operate in the Atlantic slave trade. And this is going to start to occur around the 1770s, although the abolition by the Danish has a really limited impact. Number one, the Danish don't really have any major or really, I guess I should say, profitable or influential overseas colonies. So that's number one. They don't even really have that high of a need for slave labor because they don't have a great deal of territory that they need to work. And then also the reason the Danish are rather marginal in the overall sort of push in the slave trade. They're one of the least influential European countries. They move some of the smallest numbers of people across the sea. So their abolition of the Atlantic slave trade is largely symbolic. And the reason for that is really also because on top of all this, the Danish have a very weak military and they have a very weak navy. So they can say slavery is abolished, but what does that mean if nobody else follows their lead on a legal basis? The Danish can't do anything about the Spanish slave trading, about the Portuguese, about the French, or the British. So they have no teeth to actually enforce the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. So that means it's really going to be in the 1780s, and it's going to be a push that's coming out of England. They're going to be the ones who are really functional in abolishing the slave trade. But it's not just British people who are wanting to end this slave trade. It is actually, they're going to receive a huge boost to the abolitionist movement, which definitionally just means abolitionists are people who want to end slavery overall. They want to end slavery in all human societies. They think that it's morally wrong, that ethically it does not really sync up with their ideals. And that's something that's worth taking a look at because it relates a lot to modern-day racism that we tend to deal with, especially in American society. What's interesting to look at about the Atlantic slave trade is there's always sort of been this chicken and the egg question. What came first, European racism and the notion of white supremacy, or the Atlantic slave trade? And obviously these two things go hand in hand. Racism is the sort of social underpinning or justification for the Atlantic slave trade. But what it requires us to do here is take a look over the longue durée, the big, long period of the Atlantic slave trade, to truly understand how these notions impact one another, these institutions and ideologies. What we're really seeing is when Europeans strike out into the Atlantic and they encounter West African slave markets and the availability of slaves, and they're setting up colonies, really in the 1500s and early 1600s, the notion of slavery is not anathema to Europeans. Really, there are very few people in European society that are calling slavery morally or ethically wrong. France is one of the very few. They had actually outlawed slavery in their own country since about the 1300s. The British do something largely similar, where you're not allowed to hold another British person in slavery in their own island, but certainly that was something they would allow in their overseas colonies. And so what's happening here is that when the British and the French and the Europeans are striking out in the Atlantic, they have not yet undergone what we call the Enlightenment. And really what's happening here is, if you were to ask an average European citizen in the 1500s, is it wrong to enslave somebody else and exploit their labor? The answer would not really be yes, wholeheartedly, because the system that's dominating European society is not all that much different from how slavery is operating in Africa. It's just happening under a different name. It's called serfdom. And what it's all about is the majority of Europeans are living on somebody else's land, and they're working that land for somebody else's profit. And in return, the person allows them to stay on the land, gives them a meager pittance of food. And so ultimately, a lot of European society, their labor is being exploited. And so the idea that this is inherently wrong doesn't really exist in European society. And thus, when they strike out into the Atlantic, they don't need racism to justify the Atlantic slave trade. It's justified by pretty much every economic mode of production in Europe. Nobody even thinks to question whether or not it would be right or wrong to enslave somebody and exploit their labor. However, when you see the Enlightenment occur, and that's really going to be picking up in the mid-1600s, we start to see this shift in how Europeans are thinking. It starts with scientific breakthroughs, but it ends up leading into social ideologies. And what we end up with are concepts like liberty, equality, the freedom of every man, inalienable rights, self-determination in government, and representation in government. So a lot of what spurs the revolutions in the New World to say we deserve our independence and to govern ourselves rather than be a colony of Europe, that is actually also what's going to give rise to what we can honestly label modern-day racism. When these ideas start shifting and philosophers in Europe start saying, no, every man is born with equal access to liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. Whether you're a king or a serf or a slave, these are inalienable rights that cannot be taken away from you by a government or anybody else. Well, that doesn't sync up real neatly with the Atlantic slave trade. But we also know in the middle of the 1600s, Europeans are in competition with one another. They are practicing mercantile economies, which means if I don't get it, somebody else is gonna, and then they're gonna outcompete me, and the next thing you know, I'm gonna be a slave. That's basically how mercantilism fits into the capitalist scheme when they're striking out and they're in the Atlantic world and engaging in the slave trade. And so ultimately what happens is Europeans have to reconcile these new philosophies, these new ideas about the inalienable rights of man, self-determination, liberty. Liberty and slavery don't sync up. You can't hold somebody in bondage and then say everybody has a right to be free. That doesn't make any sense. And so what Europeans are going to do about halfway through the slave trade, this is when you start to see the emergence of modern racism. This is where you start to see an underwriting concept that says the reason we can enslave Africans, and it's okay, even though we're going through these Enlightenment thought processes, is because they're different from us. They're inferior from us. Then it's okay to enslave a pagan or a heathen. It's okay to enslave somebody because the color of their skin is different from mine. And so these are the sorts of mental gymnastics that Europeans are going to go through in the mid-1600s to find a way to continue to engage in the slave trade while also saying, nobody is born a slave. Nobody should have their labor taken away from them. No one should be exploited. No one should be subjected to these kinds of inhumane systems. But we know the truth of it is all of these European economies rely heavily on that system of exploitation and oppression. And so they have to go and come up with a new justification for why slavery is okay. And that's really where the abolition movement starts to pick up. With Enlightenment thought, people start going, slavery doesn't sound like it really fits together with our new way of thinking. And that's when you're going to start to see, mostly out of religious organizations, moral and ethical objections to slavery coming about. And ultimately, in the 1700s and the 1780s, it's going to be the Quakers who are pushing this forward. The Quakers are a very pacifist group of Christians. They don't believe in violence. They don't believe in warfare. They don't believe in slavery. They don't believe in a number of things that general European society allows for. And so it's not surprising that the Quakers are at the forefront of the abolitionist movement. But they're going to need help from Africans who have lived through slavery as well. One thing I really like to stress to students is that Europeans abolished slavery on paper, but they're not doing it without the help of Africans. And two particular Africans who are going to step to the forefront of the abolitionist movement are Otaba Kubugano, and he's being born in Fantiland, which is now modern-day Ghana. And then you also have Olado Equiano, who's born in the Igbo region of southeastern Nigeria. So, what we're looking at here is that these two guys are taken into slavery. They lived through African slavery. And as a result of that, for historians like myself, they become really critical sources of information because we don't have a lot of resources to rebuild African slave systems. But these guys give their account of what it was like to be slaves in Africa. Then they describe their experience throughout the Middle Passage, and they describe their experiences in their books, or what we call slave narratives, about what they went through in the New World and the slave systems there. And the whole point of these abolitionist narratives, abolitionists are helping them to publish these. But both these guys had converted to Christianity. So number one, they're trying to basically speak back to European justifications for slavery. Number one, they're going to say, look, all Africans, and keep in mind that they had converted to Christianity, they're going to say all Africans are capable of conversion and they're all loved by God just the same as all other Christians, just like we were. In fact, Cugano goes so far as to say, I was a Calvinist from birth. No one in Ghana at that point had ever heard, or in Fantiland, I should say, had ever heard of Calvinism, let alone, and even Christianity was a pretty obscure thing to the people in his particular region. And so he says, nah, even when I was a little kid, just a little baby, I knew that Calvinism was a true Christianity, the true actual organizational factor, and the true God that sort of dictates how things go on in this earth. And so you can see that they're using Christianity because Europeans are saying, well, it's okay to enslave Africans, they're not Christian. And they're living as slaves under pagan kings who are mistreating them and abusing them. So it's better off being in slavery in America than it would be in Africa. Cugano and Equiano immediately go after that basis for justifying slavery, and they say, that's not true. So ultimately, Africans, just like everybody else, are capable of conversion, and so you can't write them off as being non-Christians throughout their entire lives. Secondly, they also, with their narratives about slavery in Africa, challenge the idea that European slavery is more benign than African slavery, and this is something Europeans would be telling themselves. Again, they have to come up with some way to justify why they can keep engaging in this trade. They make big money off the trade, so they can't just let that money go. And what most Europeans are saying, as I just mentioned, is, well, better to be a slave under a Christian than a pagan. But what these two guys do is they take a lot of time in their slave narratives to say slavery in Africa was a lot better. We were treated more humanely. We weren't legally classed as property. Violence was not the organizational factor by which people got us to work and do things. And so ultimately, they're undercutting all of Europe's justifications for continuing to engage in the slave trade. Another critical movement towards abolition is the establishment of the nation of Sierra Leone, and the capital there at Freetown. When the British start really in about 1787, the British established the Freetown colony. And what's going to be happening here is they're going to use this as a base of operations to suppress the slave trade with their navy off of the West African coast. And so what they're doing is they're raiding ships that are trading illegally there, and then they're releasing the slaves in Sierra Leone. And the slaves are founding a resettled community there. They might be taken from Cameroon or Benin or Nigeria or Ghana, but at the end of the day, they end up in Sierra Leone. And that's going to become a base, like I said, for naval operations after the turn of 1800, for the British to actually physically suppress the slave trade. Because it's one thing to write down on paper, we're not doing it anymore. It's another thing to actually go there and stop it. And so, all of this will eventually come to the head, and on the PowerPoint slides you can see a lot of detailed information about who abolishes the slave trade when. But what we're most concerned about is when the British outlaw the slave trade in 1807. Because the British are the leading naval power in the world, and they're really the only European country that can force everybody else to stop engaging in the slave trade. And so they're going to start doing that. And part of their process of abolishing the slave trade is they don't go in and attack the slave markets in Africa. They just suppress them at the coast. Anybody trying to leave Africa with slaves, they're being caught in the Atlantic by the British. Now, this becomes a huge problem for slaves in the Middle Passage, because what we're going to see is that the Portuguese and the Spanish are going to be resilient to ending the slave trade. They do not want to follow Britain's lead, even though France jumps on shortly thereafterwards, the Netherlands, a lot of other European countries join with the British. The Portuguese and the Spanish do not. And they're going to continue illegal slave trading operations. The Spanish will outlaw it before the Portuguese. The Portuguese are the last people to outlaw the slave trade in the 1860s. But the problem for slaves is that we know the mortality rate in the Middle Passage is high. But when British ships started raiding Portuguese slavers, the people who are controlling the slave clippers, the Europeans, would try to get rid of the evidence of slave trading. And what that meant was throwing Africans chained together into the ocean. They can't swim, they can't escape, everybody sinks down like a stone. And that's how the Portuguese, when the British start raiding their ships, go, we're not slave trading, show me a slave. Show me some chains. they just threw them all over the side of the boat and killed every African on board. And so the mortality rate for African slaves is going to go way up after 1807 when the British abolished slavery. Now, that moves us to start taking a look at the period of legitimate trade. While the British are making efforts to suppress the slave trade, it's not happening independently of economic considerations. The British are going to be the ones who take the lead in ending the slave trade because they're also one of the earliest European countries to industrialize. And what that means with industrialism, it's a change in your economic model. You no longer need huge laboring classes with lots of people to exploit resources from the ground. What you need is huge amounts of resources to feed into the industrial machinery. So your workforce gets smaller, but your demand for resources gets bigger. And Europeans, in particular the British here, are going to be looking for those resources in Africa. They're going to end the slave trade and immediately pick up on buying different resources. Things like rubber, palm oil, diamonds, gold, mineral resources, wood and timber. All of these things start to become crucial. Ground nuts are all crucial components of the era of legitimate trade. And what the British are doing is saying, we can make money, just fueling our industrial revolution with African materials. Why bother with the slaves anymore? It doesn't make much sense. So the fact that they're abolishing it when they do does have a chronological reason behind it. And that is because they are industrializing. The rest of Europe's going to follow shortly thereafter. And the need for slaves economically just goes away. And so ultimately what happens is they're going to go to the coastal territories where African rulers, they don't really want to end the slave trade. The coastal rulers make good money, a pretty penny off of the slave trade. And that is how they've reorganized most of their societies simply to supply British traders, European traders at the coast. French, Danish, Dutch, all these different parties involved. And so that prospect of ending the slave trade means potentially collapsing African societies that have organized themselves around it. So the process of abolition in Africa is going to be met with a lot of resistance. And ultimately what's going to happen is the British are going to go into areas, oftentimes using slaves that they've liberated from these other slave ships and resettled in Sierra Leone. They're going to use these individuals as interpreters because these people understand the language. They came from there. They understand the cultural traditions. Again, they're from there. And so they're going to function as cultural go-betweens for the British and these coastal partners. And ultimately, the British are going to force African rulers, and I shouldn't keep saying the British, the Europeans in general all basically follow this same pattern. But they're going to be forcing African rulers to accept the abolition of the slave trade. And so ultimately, while African rulers are resilient to it or reluctant to sign in, they're going to sign these slave trading treaties that guarantees they're not going to get engaged in that anymore. But there's some key components to these treaties. Number one, it does nothing to touch domestic slavery. And that is because the Europeans who are involved here know very well that these coastal states cannot meet their demands if they don't have the labor force to carry these goods to the coast. And slaves are the laboring force of the coastal states in West Africa. And most of Africa, anywhere in coastal Africa, really, even in East Africa. So ultimately what they're doing there is they're going to say, you ultimately can keep your domestic slaves because if you don't, you're not going to get us the resources we need. And then the other caveat of these slave trading treaties says, you from this date forward are now exclusively tied to an individual European country as a trade partner. In other words, if it's the British securing the anti-slave trading treaty, they're going to say, you can only do business with the British from here on out. If you're selling palm oil, if you're selling rubber, if you're selling wood, doesn't matter. You can't sell it to the French. You can't sell it to the Portuguese. You can only sell it to British merchants. And that's another thing that's going to help to create throughout the 19th century what we call spheres of influence. Basically, it's an area of Africa that Europeans can say, this is our territory. We own this place, and if you know what's good for you, stay out and don't meddle with our affairs there. And so ultimately, why these spheres of influence become rather important is because that is going to morph into the colonial boundaries of the 20th century. Throughout the 18th century, there's a lot going on in which Europeans are actively taking steps to shape Africa into something that they can govern, that they can take control of. And it won't happen formally until about 1885, and that's something we'll deal with when we get to the topic of colonialism. But it suffices to say that legitimate trade is the process by which these spheres of influence are built, because you already have an established treaty process in place with the local rulers. And it keeps out other European competitors. And that's really the goal of these treaties. Now, also something we're going to see that's drastically changing African society here is in the coastal states where you have this large buildup of domestic slaves. We still have just as many people coming into the coast from the interior and moving through the interior slave trades. But they're not being taken out into the Atlantic anymore. They're being retained in the coastal states. These people are going to change the fabric of African coastal states, and they're going to use aspects of social mobility in order to better their position, improve their access to wealth and political clout in these coastal states. And throughout the 18th century, the 1800s, the 19th century, a process that we're going to see over and over again is people who traditionally were kept out of the systems of power because of their slave status increasingly become more powerful and take on positions as political elites. And also, we'll look at this in the case study when we get there, that of King Jaja of Apobo. And that's something I'm acutely aware of because that's what I'm an expert in. I wrote my dissertation about Jaja of Apobo in the Niger Delta. But what we're seeing there is that Africans are astute. They're very, very quick to pick up on the fact that what's going on here is rapidly changing. A lot of people are unsure of the future. But usually when you have that kind of vulnerability or change, rapid change in a society, it provides an avenue for success for a lot of people, especially for people who are personally endeavoring, people who want to do well for themselves. And so what a lot of slaves are going to do is they're going to start to take advantage of traditional African systems of law and culture and policies that are playing out there, but they're also going to call upon European laws that are starting to be enacted at the coast. Mainly because you see the Europeans are setting up what they call courts of equity. Those are originally designed to mediate disputes between African traders or rulers and European traders. And they're also going to start using direct consular authority, meaning that European representatives stay in Africa and oversee how the trade is going. And if they find that there's something that they don't like or there's something that might be illegal by their terms of law, they're going to try and shut that down. But the point is that African slaves in the coastal territories, they say, sometimes it's better to take advantage of what the Europeans have going on. Sometimes it's better to challenge my slave status based on the Europeans saying slavery doesn't exist anymore. But other times, I'm better off not following European law, but following local law. And they're going to combine these two things together. And these people have come to be called, or at least it's something that's changing in the literature right now. One of my former colleagues from Michigan State, Dr. Ndebweze Mba, who now works at the University of Buffalo, coined the term Atlantic liminals. And what this basically means is these are people who are inhabiting a space in coastal Africa that is neither wholly African or wholly European. And they're going to be able to take advantage of the fact that there's two different cultural influence and legal sorts of traditions playing out at the coast. And that brings us to our case study for today that I'm going to breeze through very quickly. You have them on your PowerPoint presentation. But I can't resist the urge to talk about my own work. Who really can, right? I'm a professor. I'm supposed to be pedantic. So that is Jaja of Apobo. And he makes a great case study for us this week because he is brought into the Niger Delta trading state of Bani right as they're transitioning from slave trading to palm oil trading, the transition from slave trading to legitimate trading. And he is coming into this community as a slave. He was born in Igbo land in 1821. His father was a fairly powerful local leader in his community, and he had instituted a rule in which all the children of the community, once they had hit a certain age, had to join a standing military. And the military was ostensibly designed to fight off slave raids, so it's sort of ironic that his kid ends up in slavery. But that's neither here nor there. Long story short, his father earns the ire of a lot of other leading chiefs in the community because they don't want their kids serving in a standing military. And as a result, a lot of these chiefs conspire against Ozarumba, who is the head chief in the community, and they kidnap his son Mbanaso, whose name in Igbo means nations fear me. a sort of apropos naming, given the fact that this guy's going to later become a king and a global economic player. But ultimately, he's taken down into the Niger Delta city-state of Bani, where they primarily speak Ija. And ultimately, he is going to be brought into a leading canoe house there, the Anapepel Canoe House. And a canoe house in this region of Africa, what it is it's a socio-political, economic, religious unit. It organizes every facet of society. You have the head of a canoe house, and then underneath him are subordinates and slaves who all work for the well-being of the canoe house. If he converts to Christianity, the people in the canoe house are probably going to convert to Christianity. If he's rich, they're going to be wealthy. If he is going to be able to take on a position of political clout, the chiefs within his canoe house are going to take more important positions in the structures of the state. And so it has a distinction and if war breaks out, the canoe houses are how you organize your warriors and your troops together. They put together what they call war canoes, thus giving you the name canoe house. In the Ija language, it's known as a wari. But Jaja pops up in this region right around 1833, as best as I can ascertain. We don't have a lot of hard and fast dates for this. But he pops up there in about 1833, right as the British are really actively suppressing the slave trade in the Bight of Biafra. And so ultimately, he is brought into the palm oil trade from his earliest days in Bani's slave systems. He never learns the slave trade. He only learns the palm oil trade. And as he gets more comfortable and more acclimated to this, slaves in this region are allowed to accumulate their own wealth. And so Jaja is making money hand over fist as he keeps rising higher in the ranks of palm oil trading in this region. And eventually, when the master of his canoe house, the Anapepel house, dies, Jaja is the only one in a position wealthy enough to take over the debts that his former master had left behind. So Jaja, despite the fact that he was a slave, becomes the head of one of the most influential canoe houses in Bani. And at that point, he almost immediately enters into a huge conflict with the other leading canoe house of the state, the Manila Pepel. And the Manila Pepel are headed by a guy named Oko Jumbo, who had converted to Christianity along with his master, the former head of his canoe house. And they had been actively trying to suppress traditional religion in the area. Jaja is an animist. He never gives up his belief in traditional African religions. He never converts to Christianity. So ultimately, this breakdown between the two houses over religion is going to lead to a civil war. Jaja gets routed. He does not do well in the Civil War, and I wish I could say he did because I dedicate my life to studying this guy, but he just gets bombed out. His people get slaughtered. And he grabs his remaining followers, and he basically just leaves Bani. He takes off. And he goes up the river and establishes a new community that he calls Apobo, named after the former head of the Anapepel house in Bani, a guy named King Apubo. But he establishes the independent state of Apobo, and the British, just like Jaja's a smart guy, he's real quick. He picks up on the fact that the position that he's put his new state at, it cuts Bani off from the interior oil markets. Just like with slaves, the palm oil was grown in the Igbo interior and had to be carried to the Niger Delta. Jaja cuts off Bani's ability to get to those interior markets because of where he places his new town. And the British instantly recognize this, and they say, if we stick with Bani, we're going to lose a lot of business, so we can't do that. And in 1871, they finally recognized Jaja as the king of Apobo, the rightful sovereign of this territory, and almost every British ship trading for palm oil in the Niger Delta leaves Bani and goes to Apobo. Bani from that point down is like growing, and blah, they just take a nosedive towards the colonialism in the end of the 1800s. They have a number of slave rebellions within their state due to people becoming more influential and powerful. And then ultimately Apobo and Jaja come to monopolize the palm oil trade. But what happens is Jaja starts challenging the British. The British are pretty notorious at this point in time for breaking their own treaties. They'll say, our traders won't go past a certain point in the river. That way we won't threaten what you do, Jaja. Your job is to bring the oil to the coast. We only trade up to a certain point. But traders start going beyond these boundaries. British merchants start breaking the rules of the treaty. Jaja, again, he's quick as a whip. This guy's really smart. And he just immediately reads through the treaties. He says, you violated the treaty that you drafted up and I signed. You broke the rules here. So I'm going to seize your resources, your palm oil, and I'm going to hold the people who broke the law in one of my jails. And if you don't like it, we can deal with it through the court of equity or through consular arbitration. But you're going to have a hard time showing where I broke the law because it was your people who broke the law. Ultimately, this irritates the British consulars who are working at the coast of Nigeria. They've set up shop on an island in the Bight of Biafra called Fernando Po. That's where their headquarters are. But these are British colonial officials, or British government officials, I should say, who are stepping in and trying to meddle in the affairs of the Niger Delta. And so ultimately, as Jaja becomes more and more troublesome to the British in this area, they say, we can't deal with this guy anymore. We got to get rid of him. So they illegally accuse him. And most sources in my own research argue that they had absolutely no evidence of this whatsoever. But they say, Jaja's been trading in slaves. So now we have the right to go in and kick him out as the ruler here. He broke the anti-slave trading treaties that we signed with him. And really all this has to do with is he's not being as friendly to their business as he used to be. So they exile him to St. Vincent in the West Indies, where he lives out the remainder of his life, trying to appeal to people high up in British government to get him returned to his rightful home in Abobo. Ultimately, he's going to die of dysentery while he's trying to return back across the Atlantic Ocean in 1891. He dies on the island of Tenerife, which is owned by the Spanish, and the British have to pay to exhume his body and bring it back to Opobo. Otherwise, there's going to be a riot on their hands there because they promised to bring this guy back. But ultimately, what we're seeing here is Jaja's case study is a perfect example of all of these processes we're seeing. He enters a coastal state right as they're transitioning from slave trading to legitimate trade. He is one of those people that formerly would have found himself in the Atlantic slave trade, making that horrific journey across the Middle Passage. Rather, he's retained in the coastal state of Bani. Number two, he is an example of how a slave can gain access to political and economic wealth during this very turbulent period in coastal Africa. He's going to be utilizing both British law and local traditions and customs to get the most out, get whatever he can out of the local situation. And so ultimately he's playing both sides and represents one of these Atlantic liminals. And then finally he also shows us what happens towards the end of the 19th century as African rulers become unfriendly to European overtures. And that usually will manifest in that ruler being kicked out, deposed, sometimes killed in outright warfare. And the British are going to basically enforce their will on these, and so will the French, as will the Germans, as will all the other colonial powers that are going to start to split up Africa at the Berlin Conference in 1885. Again, that's a topic we'll cover when we get to colonialism. But that's my spiel for today. Hopefully this clarified things rather than confuse people more. As usual, if you have any questions, concerns, demagoguery, or diatribe, feel free to shoot me an email or pop into my office hours. Take care.